Greetings, Dr. John Wineland here. Once again, today we're going to talk about Alexander Campbell, his early years, basically his early life up to the time that he arrives in the United States. Let's go ahead and get started with that. Here we see the title screen, picture of Alexander, probably 50 years old. And here's a quote from him. "We neither advocate Calvinism, Arminianism, Arianism, Trinitarianism, Unitarianism, deism, sectarianism, but New Testamentism." So there you go. There's an interesting one. Rejecting lots of labels, but of course wanting to follow the New Testament. It's Alexander Campbell, 1788 to 1866. So Alexander Campbell, here's a picture of him later in life. Quite an impressive beard. Again, as I've mentioned before, if you can grow a beard like this by the end of this course, I will give you considerable extra credit. But it has to be real. Keep that in mind. All right. And he's got the beard without the mustache. Well, what can we call Alexander Campbell? What kind of titles fit him? Well, lots of them. Here's some. You call him a farmer. He had a large farm and estate. A teacher. Certainly he was a teacher. Taught people when he had an academy in his home. He started a college. He was the founder and at one time president. Preacher. Certainly he preached many sermons. One thing, of course, that people don't often mention is that he was opposed to preachers being paid. That doesn't go over too well at the ministers' meetings. He thought that preachers should preach for free and have their income derived from some other way. So there you go. You can think about that one. He was a statesman for a while. Yes, he got involved in politics. He got involved in state government of Virginia, which put him in touch with some rather famous Americans, early Americans, former presidents, and so forth. A postmaster. He actually became a postmaster in the small town that grew up around the college he started. So you might say he started a town as well as a college. He became postmaster. I think if, he was a shrewd guy, he found out that postmasters didn't have to pay any postage. And since he was mailing out a journal every month, he thought this would save him considerable amount of postage. So he became the postmaster in Bethany, Virginia, today known as Bethany, West Virginia. He certainly was an editor. He edited journals, his journal. He had more than one, usually not simultaneously, but he was editing a journal for much of his adult life. An author, he wrote many articles in those journals. He edited books about debates that he gave, so he was a fine sort of orator and one who was involved with debates. And he debates, we'll talk about some of them later in the course, the debates that he has. So these are just some of the titles that we have for him. One that I didn't put down here is that he became quite famous and wealthy for developing a particular breed of sheep. And these sheep became sought after, and this is part of the way he made money. So what would we call him there? Animal husbandry? I don't know. But he does a lot of different things in his life. He arrives in America with almost no money. And when he died, he had considerable amount of land and money, especially for his time, which would have probably credited him today to at least being a millionaire, I suppose. So he never unlike, say, Barton W. Stone, who was always rather impoverished, Alexander Campbell lived a comfortable life, let's put it that way. This, of course, affects how he views some things and the things that he does and wants to do. Well, I think we can certainly say he becomes the most dominant figure in the Restoration movement. We've already discussed his father, Thomas, who certainly is pivotal in getting things started. And we've talked about Barton W. Stone, who is obviously quite important as well. Well, I think if you mention the Restoration movement, the Christian churches, the churches of Christ, to most people who knew anything about it, his is the name that they would associate with it. And I think that's probably true, and I suppose probably fair as well. Anyway, critics have sometimes, in fact, he's so connected with the movement that some have called it his movement. They've called anyone who wants to sort of follow Restoration principles, or whatever you want to call them, Campbellites. Especially people connected with the Baptist Church. They like to call people, I guess, like me, a Campbellite. I try to correct them and say I don't follow the teachings of Campbell, although Campbell is influential. Or they sometimes call the whole thing Campbellism. Campbellism. Now, certainly we can call the movement the Stone-Campbell movement. That's also fair to say. Well, let's talk about his early life, where he is born, and how he lives his youth. Here is a map that's showing you this area is Northern Ireland. This is the coastal area of Northern Ireland. There is Belfast. And over here is Scotland on the other side of the Irish Sea. And there's Glasgow. So these are all important places where he will be. He will be in, he's born near Ballymena in Antrim County, Ireland. So that's here. And he will spend a considerable amount of his life up to his, I would say, late teen years there. So he is Irish. He would consider himself to be Irish. He spoke with a Irish brogue, born September the 12th, 1788. Now his mother, we mentioned her briefly when we talked about Thomas Campbell. His mother is named Jane, and she is French descent. She was from a line of Huguenots, which are French Protestants that were persecuted by Catholic monarchy and eventually driven out of France, basically forced to leave. A group of them come to Northern Ireland, and some go elsewhere as well, of course. So that's his connection with the French, and because of that, he will learn French as a young man. The Huguenots fled, especially after the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685. And again, we don't have time to go into all the details there, but the Edict of Nantes was basically an edict of toleration which allowed Protestants to worship in France. And in fact, when the Huguenots fled because this was revoked, it had an impact on French economy and culture, because the Huguenots were quite involved in French government and especially in business and so forth. Well, he spends his childhood on a farm near Rich Hill, Northern Ireland. So, yes, he grew up on a farm. His father was a teacher, a preacher, but you could also call him a farmer, as he was, someone who was looking to try to get some income. So he had multiple jobs and multiple things he was doing. That is his father. And likewise, I think Alexander picks up on this idea in his life. He gets involved in a variety of things. Well, here is the cow incident, I'm going to call it. So here you see a picture of the cow and a picture of a young man. This is Alexander, asleep under a tree. Before Alexander was 10, he was taught French. That was the language of his mother. The story goes that one day he fell asleep under a tree where he was studying French, at least supposedly studying French. He had the book there. The cow came over and grabbed the book and began to munch on the book and eat it, eat the pages and so forth. His father discovered this, Thomas, and he was quite angry with his son. And he said, "That cow has got more French in her stomach than you have in your head." I think this also kind of marked the turning point where his father decided to send him off to his brothers, that is his uncles, Alexander's uncles, to be trained by them for a while to sort of shape him up here. Perhaps he was getting a little too lax in his studies. At least that's what Thomas thought. Well, you know, he was 10, I guess. But his father was rather demanding that his education be solid. Well, anyway, that's one little story about Alexander. But his early education, of course, will take place in this building, the Campbell house at Rich Hill, which was not only where they lived, but where his father ran an academy. We might call it an elementary school or academy. And this is where Alexander would study. And, of course, later on, he was trained by his uncles. He has an uncle Archibald and an uncle Enos. They had an academy, and so his father sent him there for a while, thinking that perhaps he might pay more attention if his brothers, that is, if Alexander's uncles were both sort of keeping an eye on him. And they did that for a while. But, of course, the primary person in his education was his father. His father was well educated and was very committed to his son's education, and he wasn't bashful about letting Alexander know that he wanted Alexander to become a minister. He wanted him to be a minister and follow his footsteps, that is, follow Thomas's footsteps. And therefore he trained him rather rigorously in Greek and church history and sort of philosophy and theology and that sort of thing. So Alexander learned French, as we mentioned, Latin, and Greek. He was also educated in the writings of John Locke, which, of course, was an Enlightenment thinker, and one that I think will be pivotal in this idea of the development of the United States, but also the development of much of Alexander's thought as well. Well, early training continued, much like what his father was required to do as a boy. Alexander, likewise, the family was asked to memorize a portion of Scripture each day. At breakfast, they would meet, and Thomas would assign them a passage to study and then some verses to learn. These would be based upon their age and ability. And then in the evening, when they returned for an evening meal together, they would be quizzed by their father at the dinner table. Tell me, recite for me your verses or verse for today. Tell me about the passage that you studied for today. And they were asked to memorize it. I don't know how often you memorize things or how well that goes for you. Here's a little thing I just put up here, just maybe to help you memorize. Memorizing is not a bad thing. I think it's a very good thing. But as you see, this says, first of all, you should see the words and sort of break down what it is you want to memorize into, let's say, they're saying 8 words or less. Learn that part and then move on to the next. So you look at it, you read it, you study it, then read it out loud so you hear it. You want to see it, you want to hear it, and then you should write it down. Then write down the text from your memory. First write it down by looking at it, then begin writing it down from memory. This gets it ingrained in your brain. I've often said if you really want to learn a subject, it has to pass through your brain probably 6 times in different ways, hearing it, seeing it, writing it. That's why taking notes in class is important. Not just sitting there and listening. Not just, even they've even found that reading on a computer or just doing things all on a computer is not as good for you, your memory, as it is if you write it down yourself. There's a process by which writing it with your hand works it through your brain. You see it, you write it, you say it. It'll help you remember it. Well, there you go. Just a little public service announcement. By the age of 17, Alexander was helping his father as an assistant with the academy. He was teaching already the younger students and helping his father out that way. And at this time, remember, we have mentioned before Calvinism and predestination. The real issue with Calvinism, as far as your salvation is concerned, is that according to Calvinism, God has predestined you to salvation or not. So really, your salvation is not your responsibility in a sense. It's not really anything you can do about it. What you need to do is discover whether God has placed you among the elect or not. Now, the assumption is, of course, if a child is born to a devout Christian family, that the child is among the elect. But there still comes a time in your life where you have to have an experience of some kind, what they call the religious experience. It would sort of let you know that you are among the elect. And Alexander hadn't had that experience. And so he was concerned. And this is sort of beginning perhaps his journey. To have a kind of a spoiler alert, he will eventually reject Calvinism and this whole idea. But at this age, teenage years, 17, 16, 17, 18, he's beginning to wonder about his own salvation. Was he among the elect? Now, as I already told you, TC, remember I called Thomas Campbell TC, and I call Alexander Campbell AC. So you might remember them as ACTC, which of course is a band that you probably never heard of from the 1970s. So ACTC. I'm probably the only one that calls them that. That was ACDC, by the way. But TC, which is Thomas Campbell, wanted AC, which is Alexander Campbell, to become a minister. We've already said that. He did not make that a secret. So therefore, he trained Alexander. He reviewed him in theology. And of course, church history, which I think is very important if you want to be in the ministry, working with churches. His father, as we mentioned in the presentation about Thomas Campbell, becomes very stressed out by all the politics in the Presbyterian Church, and his doctor recommends he take a journey. So he decides he's going to go and explore and see if the whole family could move to America. And so in 1807, his father, Thomas, will sail about a month-long journey, sailing to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. And not even a year later, he will send a letter to his family telling them, make preparations to come and join me. We're moving to America. I've found a place where we can stay. I'm preaching at a church here. This will be our new life here. And when this letter comes in March of 1808, the family is ready to make preparations. They would have to pack and bring what they could, sell what they couldn't, and get everything ready to go. The problem was that when they started all this, they were delayed. Why? They were quarantined because of a smallpox outbreak. Now, you've gone through COVID, so you kind of understand maybe a little bit more how disruptive a quarantine, these kinds of laws and rules can be. And so they basically were not going to allow them to get on a ship and perhaps give everyone on the ship smallpox and then bring smallpox to Philadelphia or wherever they're in New York, wherever they're going to sail into. And so the ship journey was canceled. So they delayed their departure until October the 1st. The quarantine had been lifted. But this is late in the year. You have to understand, when you're sailing across the Atlantic, it's much better to do it in the summer time, say June, April, than it is to try to do it in October. So at any rate, we see that unfortunately they have a shipwreck. In fact, Alexander's sister has a kind of premonition, and so does he. And so Alexander tells his whole family, don't change your clothes when you go to sleep tonight. Leave on your clothes. Be ready. I'm afraid something's going to happen. And that evening then, as they were departing, they hit a big storm. And the storm blew them off course. And eventually, they're on a ship called the Hibernia. And you can see the ad here. Notice the passengers who intend to go to America on the ship Hibernia, bound to Newcastle and Philadelphia. They are requested to board on the 20th and so forth and proceed on the voyage with all expedition that date. So at any rate, they're leaving from Londonderry and then they would end up in Philadelphia. Well, they were blown off course almost immediately. A terrible storm. The ship wrecks. The ship capsizes. It goes upside down. The crew, in trying to save the ship and save the passengers, actually take saws and cut off the masts of the ship so they could get it to come upright, which they did. And in this process, well, of course, Alexander and his family survive. They lose a lot of their possessions. Alexander had a box, a crate of books that he was able to salvage out of the wreck. They were, of course, got waterlogged. He had to dry them out. One time when I was in Bethany, West Virginia, at Bethany College, up in the archives, they had a display of these books because they were still there, and the trunk, the small case that they were in, that had survived this shipwreck. Well, Alexander sees this storm and this capsizing and so forth as something that really shakes up his life. He had always sort of fought the idea of being a minister. His father really wanted him to do that. He now decides and vows to serve God however God would want him to serve. So this is an important event in his life, in his family's life, surviving this shipwreck, and Alexander committing himself to Christian service, I guess we'll say. Now here is an announcement about the shipwrecks. It says, in addition to the numerous shipwrecks which have been occasioned by the dreadful storm of the 7th and the 8th, we are sorry to add the following. The ship Hibernia, Captain James, of and from Londonderry, bound to Newcastle and Philadelphia, with passengers, after being out 4 days, was wrecked on the night of the 7th at about 10 o'clock on a ridge of rocks on the island of Isla. Immediately after she struck, the masts were cut away, and every exertion used for the preservation of those on board, which we are happy to learn proved effectual, as all passengers and crew were saved. On the same night, about a mile from the Hibernia, a large ship and a sloop, names unknown, were also wrecked, and all on board perished. All on board perished. So, yes, Alexander and his family escaped serious harm here. Now here is a map and it sort of details the shipwreck and then their journey. So what will they do now? They've sold most of their possessions. They've gotten on a ship down here in Londonderry in Northern Ireland. Okay, so they're coming from over this way. They went over to Londonderry. They got on a ship. They're out for 4 days, and then they shipwreck, and they are rescued and taken here to this area, right? So we see a short stay at the Isley House in the hope of Lord Campbell of Shawville. So they're here. Then they cross over the land to this port on the other side, and from there they take a ferry across here, and eventually by land to Tarbert, and then from there another ferry up to the Clyde River, and the Clyde, of course, runs into Glasgow. And from there they make their way. They decide to go to Glasgow, and there they will have to wait, because you're not going to get a ship again until several months. This is October. They're probably not going to be able to get a ship till April or May. Okay, so now they find themselves in Glasgow. No home, few possessions. Father's in America. He doesn't know about it yet. What are they going to do? Well, Alexander is going to use this time, interestingly enough, to sort of emulate his father. He's going to go to the University of Glasgow while he's there. Why not? He can get a whole school term in, because, you know, in England still today, they really don't start their schooling, university, until almost October, the end of September. So he wouldn't have missed much, and he could get an entire year in, and he wants to make the most of it. But what are they going to do for money? Well, the family was saved by some people on an island who helped them. They are Haldanes, and the Haldane people really help out Alexander and his family, his mother and the other siblings, sort of take them under their wing, and they go to Glasgow to wait it out until spring, early summer. Alexander attends the University of Glasgow like his father, following in his father's footsteps. And how did he make money? He makes money by being a tutor. Again, teaching. He taught Latin grammar, and he taught arithmetic, English grammar, and the money he uses to pay for expenses for the family, and pay for his tuition and so forth. So he's working hard. He's going to school, and he's also working simultaneously to help pay for this. Now at this time, Greville Ewing, we should mention him, he befriends the family, and especially Alexander, becomes a good friend of Alexander while they're in Glasgow. And he is a Haldane. Remember the Haldane movement? We've mentioned them before. It's not really a church. It's a religious movement, I guess you would say. They had traveling evangelists, and Greville Ewing introduces Alexander, the young Alexander, to other Haldanes, and he meets them there. I think he's impressed by them. There are several movements like this, 2 or 3 anyway, we want to mention that are going on in Scotland. I mention them here because I want to make sure that we realize that the Restoration movement doesn't start in a vacuum. Certainly the Haldane movement has some similar ideas, which are somewhat emulated by both Campbells, Thomas and Alexander. But there was also a man by the name of John Glass, who left the Church of Scotland, or the Presbyterians, in 1728, along with his son, Robert Sandeman, his son-in-law, and they start a movement that some people end up calling the Glassites, named after Reverend John Glass, or my favorite, named after Robert Sandeman, they called them the Sandemanians. I kind of like that name, Sandemanians. I don't think they liked either one of those names. But their divide over is that they wanted the church to be independent, and they didn't like the idea that basically the government ran or was involved in the church to a very high degree. And also, so they divide over this sort of church-state connection, and also the idea of how should the church be governed. Remember, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, sometimes we call it in America the Episcopal Church, is run by Episcopalians are run by bishops, which comes from the Greek word episkopos, for bishop. The Presbyterians, of which the Church of Scotland is run by presbyters, which is the word from the Greek for elders. And so they had ruling elders who would run things, sometimes with an iron fist. And what the followers of Glass and Sandeman, as we've seen also with the Haldanes, greatly favored Congregationalists, where the congregation would run their own sort of business, make their own decisions. So here we see images of John Glass, founder of the Glassites, it says there, and his son-in-law Robert Sandeman. Well, what about glasses? What is the Glass teachings, or the Glassites? I guess I hate to call it that because I don't think he liked it that, but anyway, there we go. It's easy to use. One of the things that they did, and we're going to see some similarities here with the Restoration movement, is that they had weekly communion. Weekly communion. Not like, say, the Presbyterians, who tended to only have it 2 or maybe 4 times a year. Sometimes only twice a year, sometimes quarterly. But certainly not anywhere close to weekly. A plurality of elders, not just one elder running things. So you'd have a group of elders. This is congregational rule with elders, but you don't have a ruling elder that sort of runs everything in the congregation. It would be more of a committee of the elders, a plurality of the elders. And remember, as we've mentioned earlier when we talked about some of the ideas in the early church, the word episkopos, and the word presbyteros are interchangeable. They can mean both bishop, that is overseer, or elder, that means someone with a lot of experience, right? So they use that interchangeably, the Glass teachings. They don't see a distinction then, I guess I'm saying, between a bishop and an elder. And they have deacons. The deacons are there to serve, not to rule. And so as we have mentioned, some congregations, say in the Christian church, have what they call a church board. I don't know what it's like in your congregation. But that was very common in a lot of congregations to have a church board. And the church board we made up of the elders and the deacons. And they would make decisions. So in that case, the deacons are really ruling, not just serving. And what's always interesting is usually more deacons than there are elders. So I suppose, although it might lead to some trouble, the deacons could vote something in the elders didn't want. Well, anyway, that's perhaps a discussion for another class. But the other thing that the Glass and his followers would do is reject the Presbyterian creed known as the Westminster Confession of Faith. You see an image of the cover of it here, because the creed of the Presbyterians is what they use to sort of control people and the congregations. And also, of course, it teaches Calvinism. And it also, they kind of reinforce this idea that there are those who are, ruling and those who are not. So in other words, the Glassites, if we want to call them that, rejected the idea that there was sort of a clergy up here and a laity or other people down here. They said there's no distinction between clergy and laity. A priesthood of all believers, we might say, that we are all equal in the eyes of God. So this is a very egalitarian approach. Now, when it comes to baptism, they're still holding to the sprinkling mode of baptism, and they're still holding to a sprinkling of infants. So this would be an issue where they would differ. But of course, it's also an issue in which there is some movement. Well, the glass teachings, communion weekly, remember, and of course, when they looked at communion, they see it as a memorial, and it's also closed. You have to be a member of their group. Remember, we talked about closed and open communion. Closed communion means you have to be a member of the group to take communion. Open communion means it is welcome for all. Okay, so I could say in all the churches where I have attended and served, it's been open communion. The communion is just passed, and it's up to the person to decide if they want to participate. They are not sort of screened out as they are in some groups. Well, the other thing that they practice that's a little bit different is greeting one another with a holy kiss and foot washing. So these were two practices. We can find a verse or two about these, right? And some practices of it. These are things that typically churches, congregations I've been a member of have never done. We've never practiced greeting one another with a holy kiss and really the foot washing. Well, of course, when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, he did, before that, wash their feet. So this is sort of where that comes from. They also are very strong church discipline. If they felt you were not sort of following the rules, you'd be called in, sort of called on the carpet for it. So they were quite serious about their rules and about church discipline, and I think they would ask you to leave, sort of kick you out of the community if you were not following the rules. Well, here's another group that we ought to mention. These are the Scotch Baptists. Now again, these are not Baptists that drink Scotch, although there might be a few of those that do. Normally, most Baptists avoid alcohol, but I'm sure not all. Now, these Scotch Baptists are from Scotland, and they have come to the point where they believe in immersion, baptism by immersion. So therefore, they get the title Scotch Baptists. Here's the leader, one of the leaders, Archibald MacLean, and another was Robert Carmichael. These are the founders of the Scotch Baptists. And they're still around in England and Scotland today. You can still find congregations of Scotch Baptists there. In 1762, they joined the Glassites. That is, the Glassites come to a position of also accepting these MacLean and Carmichael. But when MacLean and Carmichael make up their mind that they think immersion is the way to go, this is where they have to part company with the Glassites. And that's when they sort of officially, I suppose, be called the Scotch Baptists, because they are practicing immersion and obviously of someone who understands what's going on. This group will not just stay in Scotland, it will move to England and also to Wales. And there will be many, many divisions of the Scotch Baptists in years to come. Just like, for example, here in America, we have lots of different Baptist groups. I can't list them all here for you, but there are many, many different groups of Baptists. Well, let's move on. Let's go back to the Haldanes now that we have mentioned previously. James and Robert Haldane. And as we mentioned them, let's just recap what we know about them. Robert, you see, is the older brother by 4 years. 1764. His brother James, born in 1768. Robert, the older brother, dies in 1842, 9 years before his brother James. Now, they come from a wealthy family, and they start what is sometimes called a reformed movement of the Church of Scotland. They are not satisfied with the teachings of the Presbyterians and the Church of Scotland, which are the same. So you might think of them, if you know anything, we've talked a bit about the Wesleyan movement, John and Charles Wesley, the two brothers who set to kind of reform the Church of England with their movement. So they're much like the Wesleys, I would see it. A little bit different. They start an independent group, and they use their wealth to fund this. They are traveling itinerant evangelists that are connected with the Haldane movement. They end up with Glassite-like beliefs, but eventually will accept baptism by immersion. And since they are wealthy, they can actually fund the building of meeting houses for the Haldane movement. They can sort of help underwrite the expenses of these itinerant preachers. And so this is really what gives their movement a real push. The Haldane brothers then will have lay preaching, and they established even a theological school. So the school will teach preaching and sort of theology, and here you can see a burial stone for the Haldanes over here. They leave the Church of Scotland officially in 1799. 1799. And they form what is called the Independent Church in Edinburgh, Scotland. And that's where this picture is from, a large cemetery in Edinburgh. And so this will be their home. But from there, of course, these itinerant preachers, evangelists, will make their way out. Now later, they will divide over baptism, and many of them will become immersed. These brothers, that is, the two Haldane brothers are immersed. They decide that that is the proper thing, and that's what they do. Some people disagree, and they divide over this issue of immersion of believers, of immersion of people that know what's going on, over sprinkling of infants. So, as we're going to see, when people are coming and they're changing and they're exploring and they're studying, they don't overnight come to all these decisions all at once. It is a kind of process. Well, Alexander and the Haldanes, as we already said, his father had contact with them in Rich Hill, and I think Alexander did as well. So he did know of them. And then, of course, Greville Ewing, when Alexander arrives with the family, Greville Ewing befriends them, and he is a Haldane. So a lot of positive experiences with the Haldanes. And we see Alexander has a lot of sympathy for the independent church, and I think he's beginning to see that they have a lot of merit in what they're saying. And he has a lot of questions himself about the Presbyterian or Church of England or Church of Scotland. He's doubting the Calvinistic view of faith of the Church of Scotland or the Presbyterians. And of course, this is going to put him at odds. Remember, he's studying at a seminary. At the same time, he's going to the university. And because, he wanted to honor, his father wanted him to be a minister, and he had survived the shipwreck. And so he decides, well, he needs to take this seriously. He passed his exams. That is, in other words, he could become, he was going to become a Presbyterian minister. But we have to remember, Alexander Campbell was never a Presbyterian minister. Because when it came time for the final step, and that was to take communion, Remember, they only have it a couple times a year. It's a big deal when they take communion, very big deal. And in order for you to take communion, you had to pass a test that they would ask you of what you believed in your membership and all this kind of thing. And then they would give you a token, much like you see here, a small token, a metal, kind of like a coin. And on it, it would say, okay, now basically you'd have to present this to get your communion. So when it was time for communion, you'd have to walk forward, present your token, leave your token there, take your communion, and then you would leave, and they would reuse these tokens. He passes his exams, he's given a communion token, and as he's struggling with what he's going to do, when the time comes, he leaves the token, but he does not take the communion. And so this, at least as he remembers it, this is his break with the Presbyterian Church. He basically would say at this point he's no longer a Presbyterian. Now, his father is unaware of all this, of course. And of course, Alexander is unaware of what's happening with his father. That we already mentioned, that there in Pennsylvania, his father's been getting into trouble with the hierarchy of the Presbyterian Church, and they basically, while they haven't officially kicked him out yet, they've said, we're not going to allow you to preach. And so both of these, the father and son, are having issues and doubts, real doubts, and are basically deciding to leave the Presbyterian Church at just about the same time, but independently of one another. Now, I thought I would review, since we've mentioned that Alexander was studying really at two different places and working. How did Alexander get it all done? And I've got some tips here for you to sort of help you do better in your college days. You could be like Alexander. Be like Alexander. What did Alexander do? He got up at 4 a.m. every day. 4 a.m. Then what did he do? Well, when you get up at 4 a.m., you might be a little sleepy. So Alexander would stick his head in a bucket of cold water. He'd just go over. That's why I got a picture of a bucket here. He'd go over and stick his head in this bucket, and that would wake him up. I think it would. Especially, remember, he's doing this in October, November, December, January. It's not summertime. He sticks his head in cold water, and then he begins his study of the Scriptures. He studied the Scriptures first thing every morning. Then he would go off to his classes. His classes, unlike our classes, his classes would start at 6 a.m. And his classmates noted Alexander was never late to class. So here's my second. First of all, get up at 4. Secondly, stick your head in a bucket of water, cold water. Thirdly, study the Scriptures for a while, and then never be late to class. Be the first one there. He usually was. He was never late. And then study late at night. And that's what he did. He would stay up studying late at night, using a lamp, and reading, and writing, and studying. And then, of course, also squeezed into that day, he would be tutoring students to earn money to help the family, to help with his tuition, to help feed the family while he was there. So Alexander is making the most of his, what you might say, 1 year of college. And he probably got a couple of years' worth of stuff in there, all the stuff that he was doing. So there you go. Maybe a little advice for you during the school year. Now, the family's going to head off to America because now, of course, Thomas has already told them that, yes, come to America, and now they've gotten past the quarantine, they've gotten past the shipwreck. Alexander has been studying, and so the family leaves Scotland on a ship called the Latonia. They leave in August the 3rd, 1809. August the 3rd, 1809. So remember, they showed up in Glasgow in early October. So they've been there almost a year, 10 months, I guess I would say. And they've packed a lot in to that 10 months. They arrive then on about a month, almost 2 months later, September the 29th, they arrive in NYC, New York City. And then from there, of course, they have sent notification to Thomas, that we're leaving by letter. Then when they get to New York, probably send him another letter. And remember, no cell phones, no internet. And on September the 29th, they arrive in New York, and then they take a stagecoach to Philadelphia. And from there, they're going to have to take a wagon, a stage, all the way to western Pennsylvania. And Alexander and the family head for western Pennsylvania. Thomas Campbell is already headed out on the road to meet them, and he will actually meet them en route on the road in western Pennsylvania on October the 19th, 1809. So, this is a rendering of that happy reunion, no doubt. And I'm wondering if, as they're getting ready to meet, Alexander is fearful to be able to tell his father, "Father, I have left the Presbyterian Church." And I wonder what Thomas is thinking. I'm going to have to tell Alexander and the family that I am no longer allowed to preach in a Presbyterian church. And decided to keep preaching, but more independently. So they both come to similar ideas independently, but just about at the same time. And while they meet there, neither knew of the other's changes, but soon AC and TC, Alexander and Thomas, share their new views, and perhaps to their delight, amazement, they both come to very similar decisions about very similar subjects. And I imagine that Thomas Campbell had brought a copy of the Declaration Address with him. Alexander will soon read it, and he said that he agreed with his father, and we're going to see now that Alexander is going to rise in prominence in this movement and in the Declaration and Address. In declaring the Declaration and Address, Alexander will become really the chief proponent of this new movement that we've come to call the Restoration Movement. All right, well, there we are. A discussion of Alexander Campbell, early life, from his birth to his arrival in western Pennsylvania. Let's leave it there for now, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.